Alright, so we have talked about on this channel the monumental failures of Jared Kushner's policy agenda under the Trump administration, where Donald Trump effectively just used nepotism to put him in the position of being in charge of peace in the Middle East, and even went so far as to say that he would be the single most qualified person on the planet to go about handling that task. Now, one of the main flagship, I guess you could call it, achievements of Jared Kushner under the Trump administration was known as the Abraham Accords, and basically this was supposedly going to be the solution to the ongoing conflict, as the mainstream press likes to call it, between Israel and Palestinians. Obviously, it is more accurately identified as an ongoing apartheid and ethnic cleansing, but nonetheless, Jared Kushner came up with a plan to solve this problem, and his plan didn't even end up including Palestinians within these negotiations, and essentially what was initially touted as some sort of a grand solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was actually just basically a handout to the military-industrial complex, and basically just a military and intelligence security alliance between Israel, the United States, and other authoritarian countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, etc. So it was a complete disaster of a policy, if you can even call it a policy, but we now have good reporting here from The Intercept's Ken Klippenstein and Ryan Grimm on the fact that the Biden administration is supposedly going to be continuing with this absolute disaster of a policy. So let's go ahead and get into some of the details here. They say the Biden administration is pursuing a retread of Trump's false peace plan, and they say new negotiations would extend Trump's legacy in the Middle East with a fresh Abraham Accords. So they say for decades, achieving a Middle East peace agreement, especially one equitable to the Palestinians, has eluded every U.S. administration, with each decade seeming to push it further from reality. And they say the Trump administration's solution, spearheaded by Donald Trump's senior advisor and son-in-law, Jared Kushner, was to cut the Palestinians out of the question and organize a deal between Israel and its Arab neighbors around financial, military, and surveillance technology cooperation. And the Abraham Accords were signed on September 15th, 2020. And they say Kushner's depiction of the plan was blunt. He said, quote, "One of the reasons the Arab-Israeli conflict persisted for so long was the myth that it could be solved only after Israel and the Palestinians resolved their differences," Kushner wrote last year, and he said that was never true. The Abraham Accords exposed the conflict as nothing more than a real estate dispute between Israelis and Palestinians that need not hold up Israel's relations with the broader Arab world. Okay, he is calling an ongoing apartheid and ethnic cleansing, okay, where Israel is assassinating journalists, like in the case of Shireen Abu Akleh that we just covered last week, continuing to expand illegally into the West Bank with their settlements, continuing to impose settler and Israeli security force-backed violence on Palestinians on a regular basis, continuing to do all of this, and he is calling that a real estate dispute. Okay, not too surprising given who we know Jared Kushner to be and who the Trump family in general has always been, but nonetheless completely demented to call that a real estate dispute when they are actively violating international law and violating, every semblance of human rights that anybody who would care about that would have in the back of their mind. But basically, he just cut Palestinians out of this deal and proceeded forward as if this was going to somehow be a solution to the problem. But they continue here with more details, saying that cooperation has continued as Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has given Kushner's investment fund some $2 billion and greenlit the financing of Israeli projects with it. And they say now the Biden administration is moving swiftly to cement and extend Kushner's deal, another nail in the coffin of Joe Biden's campaign trail promise to make MBS a pariah due to his role in the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. So again, just as a reminder on some of the basics of what Joe Biden, the candidate, promised the American people. He said he was going to make Mohammed bin Salman and Saudi Arabia a pariah state. He said that he was going to hold them accountable for the murdering and dismemberment of an American journalist, Jamal Khashoggi. They said that he was going to stop selling them weapons to conduct their or continue conducting their ongoing offensive against the Yemeni people, where hundreds of thousands of children are still on track to starve in the immediate future as a result of U.S.-backed offensive actions in Yemen. So he promised all of these different things, and he has completely backtracked on every single one of those campaign promises that he's made. But this even just goes a step further, because again, as they point out here, this is Jared Kushner we're talking about here. number one, knows absolutely nothing about Middle Eastern policy or history or anything like that, given, what he just said there about it being a real estate dispute. Okay, completely fucking ridiculous. But on top of that, we're talking about a guy who took $2 billion from the Saudis, who, even when you get into the details of what the Saudis were thinking about giving him this money in his investment corporation, okay, even they knew that this was a shady deal that was going on, but nonetheless, they decided to effectively give him these billions of dollars, essentially as a bribe. But just to show you how hesitant even the Saudis were, and we know, that the Saudis have no problem getting in bed with any number of sketchy actors, but even Jared Kushner was almost a step too far for them. So, again, here from the New York Times, they say 6 months after leaving the White House, Jared Kushner secured a $2 billion investment from a fund led by the Saudi Crown Prince, a close ally during the Trump administration, despite objections from the fund's advisors about the merits of the deal. And they say a panel that screens investments for the main Saudi sovereign wealth fund cited concerns about the proposed deal with Mr. Kushner's newly formed private equity firm called Affinity Partners, previously undisclosed documents show. And they say those objections included, quote, the inexperience of the Affinity Fund management, the possibility that the kingdom would be responsible for the bulk of the investment and risk, due diligence on the fledgling firm's operations that found them unsatisfactory in all aspects, okay? And they say a proposed asset management fee that seems excessive and public relations risk from Mr. Kushner's prior role as a senior advisor to his father-in-law, former President Donald Trump. So literally they're calling this unsatisfactory in all aspects, and they still gave him the $2 billion, which means this wasn't actually for investment purposes. This was, again, effectively a political bribe for the continuation of policies like the Abraham Accords. But again, Joe Biden is deciding to continue in the footsteps of this massively corrupt, and on top of that being corrupt, just plain out stupid person in Jared Kushner, who was in charge of Middle East policy under Donald Trump. But they give us a little bit more details here, saying earlier this week, Axios reported that the U.S. was mediating negotiations between the Saudis, Israelis, and Egyptians for normalization of relations following a secret meeting by CIA Director William Burns with MBS in April. Now, secret meeting with CIA director, you know what that means, okay? It means that they were obviously trying to cover this up. They didn't want this to be exposed to the general public, and that is because, again, Joe Biden promised to make them a pariah state, and now he's basically getting on his hands and knees with his administration and various security agencies, and is trying to crawl back to MBS, and basically giving up all of those promises that he made on the campaign trail. But that's why they did a secret meeting instead of just sending somebody like Joe Biden or higher level diplomats in his place. But they continue saying the deal would hinge on the transfer of 2 Egyptian islands to Saudi sovereignty, a controversial course of action that in the past has drawn large protests from Egyptians, and pressured by rising gas prices. Biden reportedly plans to meet with MBS later this year. And of course, we remember that story of the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman outright rejecting Biden's phone calls when he was trying to get him to release more oil into the global market in order to tamp down gas prices here domestically. Completely got embarrassed by this, and still is not willing to even follow through on making them the pariah state that they are, or even pushing back on them in a public way in any meaningful way whatsoever. So again, getting on his hands and knees, and one of the most pathetic things you could possibly imagine. But they continue here saying, in another indication of the changing tides, the National Security Council convened a deputies committee meeting involving senior administration officials last week to discuss U.S. policy toward the Middle East, according to a U.S. intelligence office and a source close to the administration who required anonymity to talk about the sensitive matters. And they say after that meeting, a source close to the administration expressed frustration at the lack of focus on human rights within that policy discussion. Okay, so they're having a meeting here that was initially proposed as like the solution to the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian real estate dispute, as Jared Kushner is calling it, but now it's just transformed into a straight up like military financial intelligence alliance between authoritarian countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, etc., and Israel. Okay, this is what this is. And they're coming out here and saying that there's not a focus on human rights. Yeah, no fucking shit. Okay, when has the United States, Israel, or Saudi Arabia, or the UAE ever in their existence had a focus on human rights? That's the antithesis of what all of these countries' projects and essence really is. But no surprises there. But they continue here finally saying, While advocates of the Trump administration deal described the post-Abraham Accord framework as a peace agreement, experts warned that it only makes peace among authoritarian rulers, not with the general Arab public, for whom normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, absent meaningful rights for Palestinians, remains intensely unpopular. And they say Sarah Lee Whitson, executive director for democracy in the Arab World Now, told The Intercept, normalization, what's that looking like? An apartheid government signing a deal with unelected tyrants in the region? What kind of normal is that? And she's exactly right in that depiction there. But finally, we're going to finish off here. They say, given the unpopularity of these sorts of normalization schemes, one way to entice regional leaders is with promises of U.S. security guarantees, agreements by which the U.S. is required to provide a military response to attacks against regional partners' enemies, like when the Houthis fired ballistic missiles at the UAE earlier this year. But experts warn that such agreements will inflame regional tensions and make war more likely, particularly with Iran. And they have a quote here saying, the critical question is what's in it for the United States, said Trita Parsi, executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, in an interview. And they say if security guarantees came to pass, it would significantly increase the risk of America getting dragged into war. It also increases the recklessness of America's partners in the Middle East. They're incentivized from seeking reasonable diplomatic solutions and incentivized to pursue reckless policies with the impression that the United States will fix it for them at the end of the day. So listen, okay, we've had all of these different various campaign promises that were made by Joe Biden. He's going to make Saudi Arabia and MBS into a pariah. Okay, he's not going to sell them offensive weapons, which he immediately proceeded to do. And we know that some of these weapons were then used in airstrikes, specifically in Yemen, that did kill civilians. So, broke all of his promises, whether it's on not selling them offensive weapons to continue their ongoing genocide in Yemen, breaking his promise on making MBS a pariah and making the Saudi government a pariah state, and is now basically getting on his hands and knees after MBS literally rejected his phone calls when he was trying to beg him to lower gas prices for him. Okay, so just on every single angle that you want to look at this, Joe Biden is continuing in the footsteps of probably the least credible person on Middle East peace agreements that you could possibly ask for in Jared Kushner. So just a complete fucking embarrassment. And honestly, we still have in the background Joe Biden refusing to seriously try to get some sort of an Iran nuclear deal 2.0 up and running. So, we have the United States doubling down on supporting authoritarian and violent regimes in the Middle East, like Israel, like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, while continuing to completely ignore the rights of Palestinian people that are being, completely pushed under the rug in a situation like this, as he continues to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, continues to give billions of dollars in aid to Israel to continue these violent projects, while there's no coherent strategy whatsoever for actually increasing peace in the Middle East, while the military-industrial complex, the intelligence agencies, the CIA, the national security agencies, all of these different agencies are benefiting from this. All of the military-industrial complex weapons manufacturers are benefiting from this. Authoritarian rulers in the Middle East are benefiting from this. Palestinians not benefiting from this. The American people not benefiting from this. So, on every single front that you want to look at this is completely incoherent, and again, following in the footsteps of somebody who anyone with their head screwed on tight would not even listen to when it comes to foreign policy, specifically relating to Middle Eastern foreign policy.